Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, host of the Football History Dude podcast, right here on the Sports History Network. Now, before we jump into another sports history adventure, let me tell you about this episode's sponsor. We partnered with Rochester Sports Autographs, the largest JSA authenticated autograph distributor in the United States, where you can get deals on over 30,000 autographed sports collectibles. They even have film, music, and other entertainment autographs on the site, so there's something for everyone. Perhaps you're looking for a gift for Mother's Day, or maybe Father's Day. Heck, who needs a holiday as an excuse to give a piece of sports history to your loved ones? Or how about yourself? Today seems like a great day to add to your sports cave, right? But how is RSA able to offer such great deals on JSA authentication, you ask? Well, they do this by making deals directly with athletes, so there are no extra markups, and they choose to pass these savings on to the customer. All orders from Rochester Sports Autographs are top quality and shipped to your door with top authentication and money-back guarantee. And to make sure RSA knows that the Sports History Network sent you, we created a special link for you. All you have to do is head to shoprsa.com/SHN. Again, that's shoprsa.com/SHN. Head over there to get your piece of sports history today. This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
It is hard to believe that it has been 40 years since one of the most iconic, relived, and truly unbelievable moments in the history of college basketball took place in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was the national championship game between the Jim Valvano coached North Carolina State Wolfpack and the University of Houston's Phi Slama Jama that featured future basketball Hall of Famers Clyde Drexler and Akeem Olajuwon. It is even more difficult to wrap my head around the fact that it has been 30 years since I was in the unique position of attending a school that pulled off a monumental upset in the NCAA tournament. Yet, I am not alone. Hello sports fans, and welcome back to this latest edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, where we discuss the best of sports from back in the day. I'm your host, Dana Augusta. I'm glad, grateful, and thankful for you taking time out of your day or evening or night to give us a listen. And just a reminder, don't forget to subscribe to the show wherever you hear us. Now, coming up on this edition of the program, we're going to be talking to fellow Sports History Network podcaster, the award-winning Rick Loayza, who is the host of Basketball History 101, as we dive into the NCAA tournament. And the climax of that tournament was the epic national title game between Houston and North Carolina State. Later in the show, Rick and I are going to reminisce about being students at small, quote-unquote, mid-major schools that were in the NCAA tournament and pulled off bracket-busting upsets. And this is truly amazing. My alma mater, Southern University, and his, Santa Clara, not only did this the same year, but in that year of 1993, the Broncos and the running, gunning Jaguars were in the same region that March. So sit back, pump up the volume, because you're going down sports memory lane with the top down on Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, a proud member of the Sports History Network.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about the sports yesteryear, and so we're pleased to introduce you to Row 1, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings sports history to life. The Row 1 gallery features over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, and advertisements in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. Any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. It's your choice. In the Row 1 shop, You can pick from thousands of unique items that feature retro and historical backgrounds dating back to 1876. We have everything from clothing to phone cases to mugs, even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 for access to the full Row 1 catalog. When you buy from the gallery today, you can instantly save 15% on your purchase. All you have to do is enter the code SHN15 and your discount will be applied. That's SHN15. That's it. Simple. Save 15% off all your prints in the Row 1 gallery. Just go to sportshistorynetwork.com/row1. And don't forget to check out all the podcasts on the Sports History Network. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.
And we're back here with this special edition of Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, which is a proud member of the Sports History Network. I'm Dana Augusta once again, and coming at you tonight is a very good friend of mine, what I call the basketball guru of the network, the award-winning and up for another award host of Basketball History 101 here on the network. Here is Mr. Rick Loayza, and tonight we're going to be talking about the 40th anniversary of Phi Slama Jama versus Jimmy V, the 1983 national championship game between North Carolina State Wolfpack and the Houston Cougars of Phi Slama Jama. And you know the guys on that team, Keem Olajuwon, Clyde Drexler, Benny Anders, and that whole gang against Jimmy V and the Cinderella team from North Carolina State. Rick, great to have you aboard once again, man. What's going on with you tonight?
Oh, I'm doing well, Dana. I thank you for having me on the show. It's just a great time being here as always.
Yeah, this is your third time, I believe, that's on the show, and I look to you.
I think that's right.
I look to you for a lot of our basketball insight, and I was looking on the calendar, and I noticed that this year is the 40th anniversary of one of the most iconic moments of March Madness. Whenever you think of March Madness, you think of Jim Valvano and the win that he had against the win he had with North Carolina State over Houston in the '83 final. And we're going to be talking a lot about the road to the finals, how we got there, and all of that.
Yeah, I love this game, and like you said, it is so iconic. I mean, anytime you talk about March Madness, every year they always show that highlight of Valvano running around the court looking for somebody to hug, and he can't find anybody. This is a special game.
Now, it's special for me for this respect, and I am not ashamed of admitting this, but that is the last championship game, playoff game, postseason game. As a person, I cried at the end that I wasn't a part of. I was 10 years old in 1983 and a huge Phi Slama Jama fan. And when Lorenzo Charles dunked it, I literally started crying on the living room floor of my mom's den that they lost. My grandfather behind me was just beside himself. He couldn't believe what happened. I was in total shock and in tears afterwards because even to this day, Clyde Drexler is my all-time favorite basketball player. I'm a Celtic fan, but as a fan of an individual basketball player, to this day still is Clyde Drexler. And we're going to be talking about more about him during our discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now, he was a special player. I mean, you had a lot of future NBA players. I mean, just to think, Houston had 2 Hall of Famers with Drexler and Olajuwon. And I think at the time, Olajuwon was so young, I think it was only the 4th year of him playing basketball at all.
Right.
Which is incredible.
Now let's start off with the University of Houston. I mean, they had that team was literally loaded, and that was their second year in a row that they had made the Final Four. They had made the Final Four the year before in '82 in New Orleans. With the other players, the other teams that were there was Georgetown, North Carolina, and Louisville. I think it was also there, and we're going to talk about more about Louisville in a minute. But that team, and plus Guy Lewis was the coach. He was the coach for them in '68 when they lost to UCLA in the national semifinal with Elvin Hayes. So he came back. He's still looking for that elusive national title. He comes back in the 82-83 season with a loaded University of Houston team. Drexler and Olajuwon. Let's just talk about those two to begin with, which was the hub of that team.
Yeah, I mean, you had kind of inside, outside with those two players. As I mentioned it earlier, I mean, Olajuwon, his development was, it was lightning fast. The guy went to, I think he was 17 when he attended his very first basketball practice ever, something like that, 16, 17. And by the time he's 20, he's playing for the national championship in the United States, coming all the way from Nigeria. And, Drexler, he looked like a grown man in that game. That's the part that gets me. I watch NCAA today, and they're 18-year-old kids. You watch them back then. These guys were like 21, 22-year-old seniors. It was just so amazing to see these two, because knowing what we know now about their careers, and to go back and to see them even prior to their NBA days, and you could see it. You could see that thing that made them such special players, both of them. That made up just the way Clyde moved on the court. It was just beyond what the other players were doing. He just was so smooth and so quick.
Okay, University of Houston had other players, and Drexler. Everybody talks about how athletic Drexler was, and how of an unstoppable force Akeem Olajuwon was, especially with the turn. He had that turnaround dream shake long before he joined the Rockets. Mm-hmm. He had that when he was at Houston, and everybody talks about how athletic Drexler was, but as it turned out, he wasn't the most athletic player on the team. It was a guy by the name of Benny Anders, which gave teams fits on that squad. He was like I think they have him listed as a a shooting guard, but they used Drexler and Anders interchangeably during that time.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, Anders coming off the bench, filling in for Clyde. He was no joke. Did not have the professional career the other guys had, but you're talking about them strictly as college players, and that was, that was something to have that guy coming off the bench for your team, because they never slowed down. They could just keep hitting at you with full force, even when Drexler was on the bench.
Now, Drexler Drexler would come on the bench. You had a dynamic point guard in Alvin Franklin. You had, then you have other guys coming off the bench. Larry Mishaw, Mr. Mean, I remember him as Larry Mishaw. And the reason why I remember Larry Mishaw was because the way he spelled his last name. Me being from South Louisiana, I thought he was from South Louisiana with the X at the end, and the Creole type spelling, but he wasn't. But I thought that was pretty cool. Michael Young was the power forward. He was like the enforcer of that team. That team was just was really loaded. Yeah,
that was. Weren't they number one?
They were the number one team heading into the tournament. They were going back and forth most of the year, from what I remember, between them and Louisville, being the number one team in the country. But they had overtaken Louisville, toward going into the tournament, going into the Southwestern Conference tournament, which it was back then, I believe. And they were number one for most of the year, but it was going back and forth between them and Louisville, and I think that North Carolina had it for a little while. But it was mainly Houston for the most part that year. Yeah,
that's right. Because I remember '83 was also, I think that was, if I'm not mistaken, over at Virginia. Ralph Sampson was wrapping up his career there, and I know he had an incredible career at Virginia, and he was and then, of course, they got knocked out before the championship. But yeah, that was, you had a lot of talent all over the country that year. A lot of good squads.
And people forget that North Carolina, even though, Worthy had left for the Lakers, North Carolina was still a threat. They still had Michael Jordan. They still had Sam Perkins. I think
Jimmy
Jimmy Black was still on the team. They still had Matt Doherty. That team was loaded. You had loaded teams all over the country vying for it. And we're going to talk about more about the other two teams that were in the final, the other teams that were in the Final Four, which incidentally enough, North Carolina State, which made the Final Four out as a surprise, but that wasn't the only surprise in that Final Four either. So we're going to, and it's another school that you think of first and foremost for football, but still in all, Houston was the prohibitive favorite going into the tournament.
Yeah, they certainly were. In a lot of ways, I don't think North Carolina, on paper shouldn't have been there, but you're right. Houston was like, they were destined. They were destined to be the champions. Unfortunately, it didn't happen for them, but yeah, if I could go back to 83 and going back to the beginning of the tournament, I think that's where I put my money would have been on Houston. There, like you said, just too many weapons on that team.
They finished the regular season that year at 31-3 that year. They were the number one team in the Midwest region. They got a first round bye. They in the tournament, first round bye. Then they defeated Maryland 60-50. And I think that was Len Bias's freshman year, I believe that might have been. Or he was right around that time. There was coach Lefty Driesell was the coach at Maryland. So that they were going to be a defensive oriented team and held them to 60 points. Then they defeated Memphis State, which was back then a tournament favorite, which was a tournament phenomenon. But also, if you remember that game, it has one of the greatest dunks of all time in that game when Clyde Drexler dunked on, I forgot who the guy was that he dunked on, but if you look back on YouTube for the Houston-Memphis State game I think it was in Kansas City, and he just completely jumps clean over this guy and dunks it on him. And with that, when I saw that dunk right there, I think you smiling. I see you smiling. I think you know what I'm talking about. That's probably one of the greatest dunks I have ever seen.
Yeah, certainly. Watching when Drexler takes off, that's why they call him the glide, because he takes off like the way an airplane takes off of a runway rather than like jumping kind of straight up. It just seemed like he just sort of floated off the ground and up with his knees tucked. He would kind of tuck his knees up and right over that dude, threw it down. And I'm like, okay, this guy's going to be probably an NBA MVP someday.
And you got to remember, and imagine
that's just a gift.
Imagine me being a 10-year-old watching that. I thought that was the greatest thing I had ever seen. I thought the dunk that Dr. J did over Michael Cooper was the greatest thing I had ever seen. This topped it. And the way you described it is absolutely perfect because he took off and it was like he just floated over this guy and just threw it down. And it wasn't like the hard, massive, intimidating. It's almost like he just dropped it in. If you think of Clyde Drexler dunking, you don't think of him just trying to throw it down on somebody. Everything was so smooth with him. And with his takeoff and dunking it was just so smooth and just so precise. But it had power behind it too, but he just didn't notice it.
Yeah, no, that it was, no wonder. We're getting into a completely different topic here, but there's a reason why when Portland took Drexler that they felt like they were covered at the small forward position when it came to 84 and Michael Jordan was on the board and they're like, no, we're all set here with this kid, Clyde Drexler. He's good at the small forward. We're covered. We're going to go a different position. I kind of can understand that. He was good.
Absolutely. They beat Memphis State. Then they knock off Villanova with Raleigh Massimino, 89-71 to advance to Albuquerque, for the Final Four. Joining in the Final Four, they play Louisville, which was the number 2 ranked team in the country heading into the tournament. Now, I don't think they would do this today where they would have the number 1 and the number 2 teams on the same side of the bracket. But that's exactly what happened in this case when you had University of Houston playing Louisville.
Yeah, I did for my show, I did an episode where the NCAA, the committee that puts together the tournament bracket, they actually purposely put number 1 and number 2 on opposite ends of the bracket. So whoever those teams happen to be for that given year, they separate them in a way that the only way they could meet is for the national championship. So you're right, that would not happen today.
You had Louisville, who had won the national championship 3 years earlier, in 1980. They were making their Final Four. They were in the Final Four for the 3rd time in 4 years under head coach Denny Crum. The MVP of the 80 final, Darrell Griffith, wasn't on the team. He was already in the NBA with the Jazz, but you still had a very formidable team in Louisville, hence being the number 1, 2 team in the country. And they were led by the McRae brothers out of Mount Vernon, New York, Scooter and Rodney McRae, which was incredible. You talk about a tandem, a pair of brothers, Mount Vernon, New York. New York City style of basketball. You also had guys like Lancaster Gordon and Milt Wagner who were incredible in their own right. And people thought that this was going to be the national championship game. Rightly so, 1 versus 2, you would think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The Louisville was going through a great time at that point. I got to be honest. I used to think, I know they're not the same guy. I used to think Rodney and Scooter were the same guy.
They looked so much alike when they were twins, but
yeah,
think it was almost like if you saw one, you saw the other, and vice versa.
I thought that,
but their games were so similar.
Yeah. Well, I thought his real name was Rodney and his nickname was Scooter. So I thought, okay, they're talking about the same guy. But yeah, Denny Crum was a great recruiter, a great coach. They won they won it in 80. They're in there in Final Four in 83, and I think was it 86 when they win?
Yeah, they won it again in 86 over Duke.
So he was going to, what is that, like 5 out of 7, 5 out of 8 Final Fours that they were there. That was a great run for Louisville.
Yeah, and the early 80 Louisville Cardinal teams were just, first of all, they were absolutely well coached by Denny Crum, who was a disciple of John Wooden, who was an assistant coach for John Wooden. In fact, faced John Wooden in Coach Wooden's last game in the 75 national championship game. And that 80 team, winning the national championship in 1980, and then back in 82, and then back in 83, and then you went back in 86 and won it all again under Coach Crum. You hadn't seen anybody do something like that, reminiscent of UCLA back in the 70s, but they just was a consistent winner in the early part of the 1980s.
Yeah, and I love what you said, that Denny Crum was an assistant for Wooden for years, because when I found that out, I was like, well, that makes sense. That makes sense why they were so good for so long. I'm not that you're going to duplicate UCLA, but that might be.
Anybody can.
Yeah, nobody can do that. But to have the whole team turn over and you're still in the Final Four regularly, that's an incredible job.
Okay, then they play the national semifinal, which a lot of people thinking this was going to be the de facto national championship game. Whoever wins this game will go off to Monday night, and it'll be more or less a coronation for that team winning the national championship. Drexler and Olajuwon each have 21 points in advance to the championship game. Both of them going to the championship game. It was actually the first time University of Houston played for a national championship, because they lost in the semifinals both in 68 and in 1982. They lost in the semifinals to make it to the championship game finally. And people said that Houston showed the way college basketball is going to be played in the 21st century, which was above the rim. And that's exactly what happened in that game.
Yeah, they're my favorite college nickname, Phi Slama Jama. You would want to show up before the game started to watch the layup line, because the layup line was a dunk line. It wasn't a layup line. They were bringing it. They were bringing it every game. to entertain the crowd. That was, you're right. Is it one of the largest point spread? I think it's one of the biggest upsets still today based on the point spread.
Right.
that
I think
North
it was. I
Carolina
don't
won that
remember
game.
exactly what the point spread was for that game in '83, but it was pretty big. And then you had, I mean, you spoke on nicknames. I mean, you got this game right here, the national semifinal. You got two great team nicknames. You have Phi Slama Jama for Houston, and Louisville was the Doctors of Dunk.
The Doctors of Dunk, yeah.
And that was both of them, and it was, and basically it turned into a dunk contest. But unfortunately, Louisville, I think, ran out of dunks.
Yeah, you're right. That was supposed to be like a glimpse of the future, and I mean, it didn't quite happen that way. But those were just two good teams at the same time with a lot of offensive firepower.
Now, we talked about the University of Houston, but now we're going to switch gears and talk to North Carolina State, which finished the year that year at 26-10. Now, going into, a lot of people didn't even think that they were going to make it out of the ACC tournament, much less the national championship. But, talk about that NC State team.
Yeah, the NC State, I mean, they really should not. I mean, on paper, they should not have been in the national championship game. They were the 6th seed in the region. They Virginia dominated the ACC with Ralph Sampson.
Yep.
I mean, they were supposed to be in the championship game, or at least into the Final Four from their region. North Carolina upsets them in the ACC championship to get the automatic bid. And and you look at the scores, except for one game in the third round against Utah. If you take that game out, they won their other 5 games by a combined 13 points. I mean, they were just squeaking by round after round. It was and I don't know, I can't even think of the last time a team won the entire national championship with double-digit losses. That just doesn't really happen.
Maybe I had to look at it, but if I had to make a guess, maybe Villanova in '85.
Nova, because they were an 8th seed.
They were an 8th seed when they won the national title against Georgetown. That might have been the last team to win a title with double-digit losses. I would have to look that up, but. North Carolina, to run, first of all, in order for them to get into the tournament with that poor of a record, they had to win the ACC, which they did. They beat Wake Forest by 1, which was the beginning of a trend for this team. They beat Wake Forest by 1. Then they upset North Carolina in overtime, 91-84. Then they play Ralph Sampson in Virginia, who basically destroyed them in 2 meetings during the regular season. But somehow North Carolina State knocks off Virginia to win the ACC in Greensboro. So right there, they're coming into it as something of a surprise. But of course, it's the tournament. It's all going to wash out, at least what a lot of people think, or at least thought back in the.
Oh yeah, they had, and then they run. Yeah, you're right. They run into Virginia again in the 4th round. Well, I don't know. Do you mind if we go here through the order of how NC State went through?
Go ahead.
In their first round, they took on Pepperdine in the first round, and Pepperdine, they're no powerhouse, but they beat them in 2 overtimes to beat them 69-67, a 2-point game, 2 overtimes to get there. Then the second round, they beat UNLV by 1, 71-70. And then I mentioned earlier, there was the one sort of a blowout game. They played Utah in Utah and beat them by 19, 75.
Now, before you go any further, there's something else that I noticed while doing research for this is that North Carolina State is located in Raleigh, North Carolina, or in Durham, North Carolina. One of those. They had to travel across the country, and they played in Gill Coliseum, which is on the campus of Oregon State University. So they had to travel cross country to play Pepperdine. Pepperdine is located in Malibu, California. So, and then UNLV, another West Coast team. So they had to deal with the travel, to go clear across the country from North Carolina all the way to the corner of the United States to Corvallis to play these games. And then they beat as you said, Pepperdine in double overtime, and then they beat Utah, and then they beat UNLV by 1. So there's something going on with this team at this point right now when they advance to the next round against Utah. And then, as you were pointing out, they blew out Utah by 19? Well, I don't know what happened there. You're back?
I'm back. I'm here.
Okay.
From my end, it looked like you froze up. Maybe the same thing from your end.
Yeah, the whole screen went blank. So anyway, get back to it. I just cut this part out. But
okay.
So you were saying about Utah and they blowing out they blew out Utah in the next round, and then they had to play Virginia again in the next part.
Yeah, so now we got a rematch against Virginia. So now they're playing Virginia for the second time in a couple of weeks. But you're right, the travel, when you were mentioning about the travel, North Carolina State getting sent to the West region, meaning they're playing their entire way through the West Coast to get to the Final Four. Pepperdine, UNLV, Utah, all Western teams, and then running into Virginia again. I mean, there's no way they beat Ralph Sampson a second time. They said if they beat him in the ACC tournament, that had to have been a fluke because Virginia dominated them in the regular season. Now they're playing them again, and they get them by 1 point. And that ended. See, am I getting my years correct? Yeah. So that ends Ralph Sampson's college career, and he's headed off to the NBA. And then they get to the Final Four against Georgia. And I don't know a lot about Georgia, but I know they just lost Dominique Wilkins. Dominique Wilkins was a rookie in the NBA. So they didn't have him. But
they had Vern Fleming. The only NBA player that was on that Georgia team was Vern Fleming, who ended up playing with the Pacers for a long time. But that was the only NBA player Georgia had, and they were a bigger Cinderella story than North Carolina State was. Mm-hmm. But here's a football school, just won a national championship in football a couple of years earlier. They were in the Sugar Bowl in '82, so they were but they were a powerhouse in football. You never heard about them for basketball. And then here they are in the tournament, making it to the Final Four, no less.
Yeah, they were. That was, and you're right. And that set the thing up because it was kind of a thing where, regardless of whether NC State wins or Georgia wins, that the championship, it's really like, again, you said it's Houston and Louisville. That was the national championship. They were going to dominate whoever came out of the NC State Georgia game, that's the way it was. That's the way it had been destined to go. But that's why I tell my kids all the time. I said that's why you play the game.
That's exactly why
you never know.
They beat Georgia 67-60, led by the Vern Fleming Georgia Bulldogs. So they end up North Carolina State playing University of Houston for the national championship, the sacrificial lamb. And one of the great quotes among the many endlessly interesting quotes from Jim Valvano throughout his coaching career and his life, one that always sticks with me whenever I think of Jim Valvano was this one. They asked him what his game plan would be against Houston heading into that game, which was on a Monday night. He said, and I think Terry Gannon was the one who said this story, which was the starting forward for NC State. And he said, if we win the toss on Monday night, we're not shooting until Tuesday.
They were going to hold on to that ball.
They were going to hold the ball because you got to remember, this is '83. There was no shot clock in the NBA in college basketball, so you could just hold the ball for the entire entirety of the game, for the entire 40 minutes of the game. But of course he wasn't going to do that because it's just something for him, something very cheeky for him to say.
Yeah. Valvano, he was, and he was still a pretty young man when he coached that team. I don't even think he was 40 yet. I think he was still in his 30s.
Yeah, I think he was relatively young, but he was so young, and the press was just ate him up. He was like the Pied Piper of Albuquerque heading into that Final Four. The press just ate up his words, and he was the life of the party. And that's just the way he was as a coach and as a person. He was just the life of the party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was a quote machine. That's why, the press loved him because he was a quote machine. He loved nothing more, and now just reading other books about Valvano, he loved nothing more at the time than to have the press gathered around him, just as he's telling stories about his Italian family, stories from Iona College, stories from wherever, and that guy held court like nobody else.
Now, North Carolina State, you look at that roster, and you look at, I mentioned before Terry Gannon, who didn't play in the NBA. A lot of people know him as an announcer now for ABC Sports. But you had one player you had actually a couple players that played in the NBA, but one notable player for North Carolina State that played in the NBA, that was Thurl Bailey.
Mm-hmm. I remember that guy. He played on the Utah Jazz for a long time. I think he got taken by Minnesota in the expansion draft or something, but I remember him in Utah. And and I think he wore goggles. If I'm not mistaken, was he one of those guys, one of the goggle?
Yes, he did. He wore the goggles like Kareem did. He wore the goggles when he came into the league, and that was Thurl Bailey. That was the Jazz from the mid to late '80s when they were coached by the great Frank Layden, and they were a very entertaining team. Not as entertaining as a coach, but he was a very young John Stockton, a very young Karl Malone. I think Jeff Malone was on that team. I think Blue Edwards was with the Celtics. But that in the late 80s, early 90s, Utah Jazz, they were the up and coming. They weren't like the Jazz of the 90s yet, but they were up and coming. And Thurl Bailey was a key piece to that Utah Jazz team during the late 1980s.
Yeah, and in watching the game, I mean, he had a really great kind of a mid-range jumper from the baseline area, just kind of maybe one step beyond the block is where he loved to shoot it from, and he was solid, absolutely solid.
Then you had the dynamic backcourt, Derek Whittenburg and Sidney Lowe, and you talk about two guys that were pretty much like basketball synergy. Those two, but their personalities were completely opposite. Sidney Lowe was from what I remember, Sidney Lowe was a guy that was really kind of quiet, kind of like try to blend into the background. Wittenberg, on the other hand, was basically an extension of Valvano. Not only coaching on the floor, but as well as the personality. He was the personality of the team.
They were great guards. Wittenberg, I believe he was the leading scorer of the tournament, something like about 120 something points between all 6 games, but he led the tournament in scoring that year. He was their go-to guy, and it was their chemistry was obvious on the court. I mean, even though they were the 6th seed, I mean, you don't get as far as they got without good chemistry, and they definitely had that in the backcourt. And I think if you had to look at where they got outplayed in that game, NC State between Lowe and Wittenberg outplay Franklin and Alvin Franklin and Michael Young, who were the backcourt for Houston. I think they just had kind of more veteran leadership. I mean, I know we're talking about college kids, but Lowe and Wittenberg, where I think they were juniors or seniors. And then Alvin Franklin for Houston was a freshman, so he didn't have a lot of experience, and that's where I think NC State gets the edge.
So the game starts, okay, and the game itself, I went back and watched the game, and the one thing that really caught my eye was the fact that NC State played with absolutely no fear in the first 20 minutes of the game. Talk about that first half, if you could.
Yeah, they came out hot. He started the game, I think it was 6-0 before Houston even scores their first point. And that got Houston on their heels because they came out aggressive. I think I'm assuming that Valvano's pregame speech, something like, hey, we got nothing to lose. We're the 6th seed against the number 1 team in the country. Just go after it. And that fire that I think only Valvano could give his team, they came out aggressive and were attacking the rim. They started 6-0, and you could see, because I did the same thing. I watched the game again, getting ready for this, and you could see the kind of the worry on the faces of the Houston Cougars. They were like, "Oh no, this is not supposed to happen. We're not supposed to be down 6-0." And and I think they caught Houston definitely by surprise. And then eventually they got out to something like, it was like a 9-10 point lead. I think 10-point lead at one point in the first half, and they were just taking it to Houston. And it wasn't supposed to be happening, but it was happening. And Houston was having a hard time recovering mentally from basically, they got punched in the, NC State, they punched Houston in the mouth to start the game, and Houston wasn't sure what to do.
Another thing that happened in the first half that really hampered the University of Houston, and it's something that never really happened with them, but they had to deal with something that they didn't necessarily deal with. And I think Gary Bender or the guys that were calling the game, Gary Bender and Billy Packer, noticed this. Clyde Drexler gets 4 fouls in the first half. That really curtailed. And this fourth foul was probably one of the more controversial moments of the game, when he drew an offensive, or Terry Gannon drew an offensive foul on him to get his fourth, and that really hampered the University of Houston.
To me, it looked like Gannon was still moving. It didn't look to me like Gannon had his feet set. And you're right. So to get his fourth before halftime was, how do you even handle that? And to me, it looked to me with the first 3 fouls were fouls from the defensive end. It just looked to me like Clyde Drexler was just trying to do too much defensively, a little too aggressive. There's one, I think the third foul he got, rather than just keeping his hands straight up, he slapped, I forget who was shooting. He slapped him across the wrist as he was taking the shot. And it's like, man, Clyde, just keep your hands straight up. You would have been fine. I think he just wanted it. I don't want to say he wanted it too much. That there's no such thing as, okay. They ran off, I think, the first 10 points of the second half, 10 or 12 points that Houston ran off with Drexler on the bench. So that was, obviously the adjustments were, it was like, let's just go to Akeem. And when I look back at the final, at the box score, in the end, Akeem Olajuwon scored more points than the other 4 starters for Houston combined. And that was surprising for me as I was walking through or looking through the box score for this game. It was just so heavy. It was Olajuwon heavy, which it had to be to keep themselves into that game.
Now, Olajuwon was in the second half carried the load for the University of Houston, but really it was another thing that was really hampering Olajuwon, and that was the altitude of Albuquerque, because he had to get oxygen every time, doing every stop, every timeout, a television timeout. You saw him on the sideline getting oxygen.
Yeah, I didn't realize that Albuquerque's altitude was that. I've been through Albuquerque, but of course I've been through as a tourist, not as a basketball player. But I didn't realize the air was that thin. But you're right. There was one point in the second half where you could see the coach for Houston. He could see Olajuwon struggling to catch his breath. So he told the guards just hold the ball. Like, don't run the offense, and just let's give Olajuwon like 10 seconds here to catch his breath. Of course, eventually Olajuwon needs to come out. And you're right. He was sucking on that oxygen mask to get ready to get back into the game.
Okay. Fast forward to the final minute of the game. Houston's up by 1, if I'm not mistaken. No, it's tie game. Houston and NC State tied at 52. Valvano says, we're going to hold for the last shot. Okay. Then everything's all set up for pretty much one of the greatest single plays in the history of college basketball, one of the most memorable plays in college basketball. Kind of like walk us through that those final seconds of the national championship game from 83.
Sure. So they come out of that timeout. You're right. Valvano says, let's hold for the last shot. Houston, Guy Lewis threw something different at him, because that whole game, Houston had been playing man-to-man. Now they come out in a zone trap. And knowing that North Carolina State was going to probably try to hold the ball, they wanted to trap the ball handler. And so NC State, whose intention was just to pass the ball around until they got down to the last 8 or 10 seconds. Now they're passing the ball because they're getting trapped. They're moving the ball to try to maintain possession, and the ball is just swinging around. At one point, right before that last shot, Thurl Bailey has the ball in the corner, and he kind of freaks out a little bit. He throws a very hard pass toward center court that almost got stolen. It nearly got stolen, and then I think it was Wittenberg who caught it. Turns, and of course now there's like 2 seconds on the clock. He's about 5 feet maybe behind the 3-point line, and just has to launch because otherwise they're gonna end up just running out of time and going to overtime. So he launches. The shot is so off. It is so off, and of course the ball falls right. Lorenzo Charles catches that ball just under the rim, and in one motion goes up and dunks it. For the victory. And I forgot at this that this is the way college basketball used to be. The clock did not stop after a made basket.
That's true.
So when he dunks it, there's actually like the clock technically still said 2, and it was as the ball was going through, it's kind of counting down to 1, and it's not stopping. And Houston couldn't even get the ball in. I mean, today that clock would have stopped, and Houston would have had like a second and a half to try to do something. But not back then. They just the clock ran out. Everybody they charged onto the court, and
Valvano looking for someone to hug, and all of
yeah,
that.
Valvano was looking for somebody to hug. The players are hugging each other. The cheerleaders are hugging each other. Parents are hugging each other.
Some 10-year-old up in Louisiana crying his eyes out. So
well, you had good company, because if you go back and you watch that video, a lot of the Houston players, the ones that were sitting on the bench, just kind of fell off their chairs as they realized what had just happened. They fell off their chairs. They're crying. I can't remember which player this was. He's literally pounding the court with his fist because he can't believe what just happened. And as the cameras are catching the Houston players on the bench, I mean, as they realize the camera's on them, they turn their head because they can't. They don't want to see the camera. They're looking away. They're putting towels over their heads. They're
right.
I felt bad for those guys. That's a tough way to lose.
And now one of the great, I guess you could call it an urban myth of that play. A lot of people think Derek Wittenberg hit the shot, because the reason why was because that was the last thing that Gary Bender, who called the game for CBS, was saying when the ball went through. And it wasn't Derek Wittenberg. It was actually Lorenzo Charles. That you hit Derek Wittenberg, and everybody thinks it's Lorenzo, but it was actually Lorenzo Charles who actually made the dunk, and which was one of the great ironies of sport. Phi Slama Jama loses the national championship on a dunk, which is one of the great ironies of college basketball.
We at the Sports History Network are thrilled to work with our sponsors and partners. With their support, we are able to produce great content for you. The other cool thing is most of our sponsors and partners offer discounts to pass along to our fans. So if you go to the sportshistorynetwork.com/sponsors page, you'll find Row 1, Royal Retros, Play Classic, Thrive Fantasy, and Mega Seats. All of these offer great discounts. Specifically at Row 1, you can save 15% at the Row 1 Gallery with the code SHN. The Row 1 Gallery includes over 5,200 reproduced sports history prints on a variety of sizes of wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. The Row 1 shop also has thousands of more unique items with retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts and long-sleeve shirts, phone cases and mugs, blankets and pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. With Royal Retros, they're the king of throwbacks. They've got jerseys, shirts, hats, collectibles, and more from defunct leagues and other teams in those leagues. From Play Classic Games, it's sports simulation board games. Just use the code SHN for 10% off your first order. From Thrive Fantasy, it's a daily fantasy sports and esports app for player props. Use the promo code SHN for instant 100% match up to $100. And with Mega Seats, they're tickets with no fees. You can save up to 10% with the code SHN. So check them out on the sportshistorynetwork.com sponsors page. That's sportshistorynetwork.com/sponsors. The soundtrack is provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.
And ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, which is a proud member of the Sports History Network. And right now, in this special March Madness edition of the show, we're going to take a little journey back down memory lane and do a little personal retrospective with my main man, Rick Loayza, the host of Basketball History 101 here on the network. And it was a very interesting thing that I discovered whenever I did my research, was the fact that Rick Loayza and myself have something very interesting in common. And that one thing that we do have in common is the fact that he and I both attended schools that pulled off major upsets in the history of college basketball, in the history of the NCAA tournament. Not only that, it happened in the same year, and even more unbelievably, in the same part of the bracket. His alma mater, Santa Clara University, with the great Steve Nash, pulled off the upset by beating number 2 Arizona in the 93 NCAA tournament. The very next day, March 19th, 1993, my alma mater, Southern University, knocked off Georgia Tech in Tucson, Arizona for their first ever tournament victory. So, and this happened within the same region, within 24 hours of each other, and two members and two proud graduates of those two wonderful universities are talking right now about those two wonderful memories that we both have. Rick, thank you for joining me once again.
Oh, thank you, Dana. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, from my perspective, first of all, I'm going to let you go first, because mine has a little bit of a backstory with this, but I think that you'll enjoy this as well. Talk about Santa Clara, the Broncos. They had a freshman point guard by the name of Steve Nash, which you may have heard of, but he wasn't the main cog of that Broncos team. Talk about who was really the main piece of that Santa Clara Broncos team.
Well, sure. Now we're talking about a Steve Nash that was on nobody's radar. He's a freshman coming from Canada. Nobody had heard of him. Nobody had recruited him. Santa Clara decided to bring him in as part of actually a rather large freshman class. 7 freshmen came in, and honestly, Nash was just 1 out of 7 new freshmen. Nobody knew that this guy was going to be who he became, and he wasn't the starting point guard. He was a point guard, but he was the backup. He came off the bench his freshman year for John Woolery, who was a junior. He had been the second year as a starting point guard. And it was an incredible time. It was my freshman year as a student. I was just a regular student there at Santa Clara, and watching our team make it to the NCAA tournament. Just to get there, we had to upset the University of San Francisco in our conference tournament to get the automatic bid, or else there's no way we're there without the automatic bid. But Nash did play 30 minutes of that game off the bench. So he kind of functioned like the 6th man, so to speak, to come in for at the time was first year coach Dick Davey. He had been an assistant at Santa Clara for years, but it was his first year as the head man. And I remember sitting around, a bunch of us were sitting in the lounge in the dorm watching Selection Sunday. Now we knew we were in it, so we weren't waiting like seeing if we got in. We knew we were in. We were just waiting to find out who we were going to play. And it was the selection show was nearly finished, and we still hadn't heard our name. And then at the very end, we hear, number 2 Arizona will take on number 15 seed Santa Clara University. And there was a groan in the room, like, oh, number 2 Arizona. That's who we've got to play. It's like, we have no chance. And when I looked at it, I went back and I looked at the game in the box score. All 5 starters for Arizona eventually played in the NBA, including two of their bench players also made the NBA. For Santa Clara, it was just Steve Nash was our only future NBA player, and he was still a freshman coming off the bench, still developing. And somehow we did it. We had nothing to lose, is what it was. And I wish I could say I watched it on campus with a bunch of other students. Actually, I wish I could say I went all the way to Utah to watch the game, but it was spring break. I was at home watching it in my living room by myself, but I could not believe what I was seeing. And just to be part of that, to be part of the school that was making a Cinderella run the way they did. I mean, we got them. The incredible thing about it is we had a 12-point lead. At one point in the game, we were up 33-21. And then for the next 12, 13 minutes of game time, Arizona went on a 25-point run, 25-0 run on us. And now they're up by 13. We get it back together. We are able to score. Arizona started getting into foul trouble. Fortunately, we were able to take advantage of foul trouble. But to get back to your original question about who was the main guy, we had a 6'9" forward by the name of Pete Eisenrich. And he was our main guy. He scored 19 in that game. He was like a 16, 17 point per game scorer the whole year. So you had Eisenrich as our leading scorer. John Woolery is our main assist guy. We had Dwayne Lewis, who was considered our best athlete. He was a senior. He was our best athlete. And he kind of played kind of a wing type player. And then another senior, Mark Schmitz, who was kind of our shooting guard. So he was Mr. Outside. I mean, none of these guys, you don't know about any of these guys because none of them made the NBA. But for a mid-major, I mean, these were our guys. These were the guys that carried us.
And you, Santa Clara, y'all knocked off San Francisco. Was that the West Coast Conference back then? Or?
We are in the West Coast Conference, which of course has been dominated by Gonzaga for the last almost 30 years. But yeah, that's the conference we're in.
So you could probably say Santa Clara that year was in Gonzaga of the college basketball world at that time.
For that year, we were.
And you mentioned that Arizona had NBA players. I mean, you had Chris Mills, you had Khalid Reeves, you had Damon Stoudemire, just to name just three of them, and they were the number 2 seed in that region, okay, which was impressive. Lute Olson, that was another coach that was just trying to make, for what I remember, Lute Olson, with that team, they've always was one of those teams that will make it to the Final Four or the Elite Eight. They would always get far, but could never get over the hump. They didn't get there until 97 with a team that no one predicted to do anything. But that's just how it was. I mean, he had powerhouses at Arizona during that time.
Oh, absolutely. And you were right. Damon Stoudemire, Khalid Reeves, Chris Mills, those are the three main guys. And they also had Ed Stokes, who was a senior, was going to play in the NBA the following year. Their other guy was Ray Owes, also played briefly in the NBA. Reggie Geary was a freshman, played briefly in the NBA. And they were just loaded all over the place. I mean, when you're a mid-major, you're taking on a team with 7 future NBA players. I didn't expect us to get that second game. That's for sure.
And then you guys played in the second game. Now, who did y'all play in the game afterwards?
Oh, yeah. In the second round, we played Temple University. They beat us by 11. Yes, Don Chaney leading that squad. And in that game, Aaron McKee, if you remember Aaron McKee in the NBA, he scored 25. Rick Brunson, that's Jalen Brunson's dad.
Brunson's dad.
He scored 20, and then Eddie Jones chipped in 17. So those three guys by themselves outscored Santa Clara. So
at least with Santa Clara losing, they lost to Temple. Us, we lost to George Washington. Now let me get to Southern University. This was the first time since the late 90s since the late 80s that we had made it to the tournament. It was Southern University. They were the highest scoring team in the country that year. They averaged 97 points per game. which was impressive. I really didn't know it at the time, but because I was too busy going to games and trying to get phone numbers, but that's another story for another day. They led the nation in scoring with 97 points per game, and no one on the team made it to the NBA.
Yeah, what were they? They called you guys the running
gunning Jaguars.
The running gunning Jaguars. And I know this was now 3 years later in 95. Santa Clara plays Southern. I think you had already graduated, but it was my senior year, and I was one of the broadcasters for Santa Clara on Santa Clara radio. And so I was on the microphone on the night that Santa Clara, we hosted Southern. They were coming in, the running gunning Jaguars. And I think in that game, it was something like, it was like 98. We won like 98-57. And we only averaged like 55 points a game. And so I knew the running gun and Jaguars. I'm like, oh, we're gonna put up some big numbers in this game. And we had 98 that night. It was again, that was like a year or two after your time at Southern. But yeah, I remember we played them.
Ben Jobe was the head coach for Southern, and he in Southern that day, March 19th, 1993, plays Georgia Tech with Bobby Cremins. By him, Coach Jobe and Bobby Cremins actually coached together at the University of South Carolina in the 70s. They were both assistant coaches under Frank McGuire. And Cremins had been knowing Coach Jobe for years. And if you know anything about Ben Jobe, he probably had the greatest wardrobe for a coach you could ever see. This guy could have been a model for GQ magazine with the type of outfits that he would wear, the suits that, he looked like he stepped out of the pages of GQ magazine with the type of suits that he had. Okay. Then we win the SWAC tournament title, and then we get the word that we're going to be playing Georgia Tech, and of all places, Tucson, Arizona. I don't think anybody on the team had been any further than Houston in their life, to be completely honest. From my personal perspective, and I would take this memory with me till the day I die. And this is one of the great memories of my life. But the one thing that I always remember about that game was the morning of the game. It was on a Friday afternoon. They had canceled classes at 12 o'clock. So there were no classes. We were still in school. We weren't on spring break yet. I think spring break was the following week or something like that. Or the week later or whatever. But we were still on campus. And I remember one of my friends who lived in a dorm, I was living on campus at the time, one of my friends from Washington, D.C. named Terrence Tompkins. I guess for that game, he became Southern superfan. Because it's like 9 o'clock in the morning and he's walking up and down the dorm in full Southern University regalia, just ready to go, for the game. They're going to have a watch party on campus at the brand new, newly remodeled Smith Brown Memorial Student Union Cotillion Ballroom. Now you got to understand, this is a brand new. They just remodeled the student union. There's going to be a watch party at the Cotillion Ballroom. And we get there to watch the game, and maybe 10 people show up. There's like about 10 or 15 people there. Having 10 people in that ballroom is like having 2,000 people in the Superdome. I mean, it's like no one's there. And I'm like, where is everybody? So game starts. And of course, I'm thinking to myself, we're about to get blasted. So I don't want to be here too long. But Southern hangs around. They're hanging around. It was 44-39 at the half. Okay, and we're only down 5. We're hanging around with these people. By this time, I turn around and I notice there's a buzz in the crowd. I turn around. There are like 100 people here. Like, where do all these people come from? And the second half comes, the second half starts. We outscored Georgia Tech 54-34 in the second half. We ended up winning 93-78 for the first time we win a game in the tournament. People were so beside themselves. We had the news crews from Baton Rouge all over came to the campus to interview people, to take part of the celebration and everything. And that's when one of my friends said that LSU now stands for Love Southern University and stuff like that. We were just, we were just so beside ourselves. And like I said, no one on our team ever played in the NBA. Our main guy was Javon Scales, who was basically kind of like a poor man's version of Sean Kemp. This guy was incredibly athletic. 27 points, 27 points and 18 rebounds in this game. So he was just manhandling. And the way that Southern played that game was essentially up tempo, something that Georgia Tech was not used to. And of course, Georgia Tech had two NBA players as well. They had Drew Berry, the son of Rick Barry, and you also had Travis Best, who later played with the Pacers and led them to the NBA Finals one year, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was that Pacers team in the late 90s, early 2000s that played the Lakers in the finals in 2000, or was it 99?
Yes, 2000. 2000 we played the Pacers.
And it was like one of those, and I mean, we had Javon Scales, we had another guy named Vincent Jumbie Jones, who was our point guard, which was our backup point guard. He was only like 5'6" or 5'7", but he had like a 44-inch vertical. So he pulled off a couple of dunks in that game, from what I remember. But Georgia Tech had Malcolm Mackey, he had 27. James Forrest had 24. They had won the ACC championship. So I'm walking into that cotillion ballroom thinking to myself, we're about to get blasted, dude. I just have a feeling. But to my Jags credit, to those running gun and Jaguars, they didn't quite get to their 97 or 97 point total, but they came close to scoring 93.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's big. Anything in the 90s, that's big in college.
And they have a banner in the activities, in the FG Clark Activity Center at Southern still to this day, with the banner 1992-93 Southern University and the NCAA's highest scoring team or something like that, or scoring champ or something like that, still hanging up in the rafters. So that's pretty cool. And winning the SWAC and winning a tournament game. I think they just made banners for that too. I haven't been really back since, just for a couple of times, but it was like years ago since I've been there, since it's been way since before. I've been living in Atlanta for 10 years now. So it's been a while since I've been back on campus. But that's the one thing that I always take away from that.
Yeah. Yeah, Santa Clara does not go to the NCAA tournament often. In fact, we haven't been back to the tournament since Steve Nash graduated in 96. So we're on, what is this, 27 years in a row without getting into the big dance. Didn't go very often, but we went 3 out of the 4 years that Nash was there. We made it his freshman year, which is same as me. I was a freshman the same year he was a freshman. So freshman year, junior year, and senior year, we make it to the tournament. Freshman year, we won the first game, got knocked down the second game. Senior year, we did the same thing. We beat Maryland in the first round, and then lost to Kansas in the second round. And then that was Steve Nash's end of his career.
But this is so much fun to go back in the years and talk about, not only, talk about this great, your recollection as well as my recollection of Southern University and the Santa Clara Broncos. I mean, that's, and you mentioned the fact that we did play each other a couple of years later, and of course we got spanked. But I'm not going to go into that too much as a proud Southern University graduate. But Rick, thank you once again for coming on to share your experiences at Santa Clara, watching Steve Nash, watching your Broncos, and I'm glad I was able to indulge you with my recollections of Southern. So glad to have you on, man. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I mean, these are great memories. That's one of the reasons I went to Santa Clara, was I wanted to have that Division I experience of watching my teams, play other big name schools. And those are definitely some of my best basketball memories.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really, really appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, that will do it for this edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. Thank you for listening. And as a reminder, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you can get new episodes whenever they are released. And also, please check us out on Twitter at HistoricallySP2, where you can get your daily dose of sports history. And you could also drop us a line or two at historically.speaking.sports@gmail.com. I would like to once again thank Mr. Rick Loayza, our award-winning podcaster here at the Sports History Network, for coming on the show to share his vast hoops knowledge with us. And if you haven't subscribed already, please do. Tell your family, tell a neighbor, tell a friend, even tell a passerby on the street about us. I would really, really appreciate it. And until next time, I'm Dana Augusta from the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, saying so long.
Hi, this is Joe Ziemba, the host of When Football Was Football, here on the Sports History Network. I'm very pleased to announce that I will be partnering with the Sports History Network to give away 2 copies of my latest book called Bears vs. Cardinals, the NFL's Oldest Rivalry. To enter, just head over to the following link, sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways. We hope you will enjoy the numerous stories in the book, which is largely based on the newly released Dutch Sterneman collection at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Dutch was the co-owner of the early Chicago Bears with George Halas and kept correspondence, financial records, and scouting reports, which now allow us to peek into the management of an NFL club during the first few years of the league's existence. Along the way, we'll meet unusual gridiron characters from years gone by, including a quarterback who could throw the ball farther behind his back than he could throwing it forward, a Bears lineman who was such a good tavern fighter that he decided to enter the boxing universe, and a Cardinals halfback who gave up the NFL rushing title by deciding to not show up for his team's final game of the season. And can we forget the time the Al Capone mob interrupted a Bears-Cardinals game? The new book was fun to research, and I hope you will enter our free contest today. Once the winners are selected, we'll be in touch regarding shipping as well as to inscribe the book personally for you. This might make a perfect gift for Mother's or Father's Day, or simply add it to your own personal collection. Once again, enter by visiting sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways. Thank you and good luck.